Okay, so moving on from there, um, just one other thing I wanted to mention in terms of correlation and causation. So both of these different experimental design, or rather research designs, because only one is an experiment, should be matched up with the appropriate terminology. So correlation, if you test something using a correlation, you should be saying things like, is X linked to Y? Are those who smoke at higher risk of lung cancer? Is teenage drinking associated with um, problem drinking as an adult? Obviously correlated with. Uh, Prefers, that would be another one that's kind of when there's some sort of choice involved. So I don't know. Do teenagers prefer X, whereas adults prefer Y? That would be correlational because, well, that would be quasi-experimental more so, as you'd be, comparing two groups, but you're not manipulating their age, obviously. More or less likely, so that's another one. Are those with um, who drink as a teenager more likely to drink problematically as an adult? Predict. We talked about that one before. So, does your high school GPA um, predict your college GPA or your success in college is tied to or goes with, or kind of the last ones. So just notice how none of these terms really imply causation. They just suggest that there's a relationship there. So those with X tend to be more likely to, tends to be associated with. None of these say um, cause, right? They don't say has an effect, right? So it's important to kind of, even if you specify that, oh, I'm using a correlational design, if in when you're writing a paper and in the discussion or wherever throughout the paper, if you use the wrong terminology, it can be very confusing because what you're implying is no longer matched up with how you actually tested it. Then, of course, with causation, we do actually use, well, obviously, causal terminology like causes, effects, make, curb, changes, leads to, makes, hurts, adds, promotes, reduces, prevents, distracts, fights, worsens, increases. You don't have to remember all these, but just kind of think about when you choose a word, choose words for your hypothesis, or you choose words for any point really in your paper. Think about what those words imply. So, are they implying that there's just a relationship, or are they implying that there's an actual effect there? That one variable is changing another variable. It's not just associated with another variable. Okay? All right. So, the last thing I want to talk about for this section is internal and external validity. So, these kind of are to some degree the quality of your study, as well as how well it generalizes to what you're actually looking at studying. So, the former is, of course, internal validity. This is really just a measure of the quality of your study or how close you can get to causality. So I just want to clarify when it comes to experiments, though we have evidence of causality, we don't have proof of causality. We don't know for certain because we never prove anything in psychology, right? We're tentative. Don't forget that. We talked about earlier. Um, you might satisfy the first two of the criteria. So you might establish that there's covariation between the independent and dependent variable, and you might establish temporal precedence, that one variable came before another. The third criteria, remember, was can we rule out alternative explanations? Well, no, we can't exactly rule them out with absolute certainty. There are some studies where there's pretty strong evidence that there isn't any alternative explanation. There isn't any confound um, or other thing that's going along with the variables, with the thing you're manipulating, but we're never 100% sure. So there's always the possibility that something could be something that you're not intending to manipulate is actually changing the dependent variable rather than what you say is changing the independent changing the dependent variable. Right? That's always something to ask. Are there alternative explanations for your findings? Did I manipulate something other than what I said I manipulated? Um, so again, this can be third variables in the case of correlational studies. So something that you didn't account for. Think back to the correlation between ice cream sales and shark attacks, right? A not educated person might say that selling more ice cream causes more shark attacks, but we know that there's a third variable there. We know that as the weather gets warmer, more people go swimming and more people buy ice cream. It getting warmer is correlated with both of those variables, giving the impression that ice cream sales and shark attacks are correlated, but it's really just that third variable that both of them correlate with. Um, so that could obviously be a threat to internal validity when it comes to correlational studies. And a similar thing could apply with experimental studies. Is there some sort of confound? Is there some sort of thing that's being manipulated or changing that you're not intending to change? Is the independent variable covariating with something else that you're not aware of or did not intend? Right? I'll give you an example, one more example of confounds. I think we mentioned this one before, but let's say I was looking at um, are uncommon words easier to remember? So really obscure words like I don't know, whatever whatever you can think of. Are those easier to remember than um, familiar words that you encounter often? Well, something that could be a confound there is word length. It could be the case that less common words also tend to be longer, have more letters. So I would need to hold that constant in some way. I need to make sure that it's not that the rare words, the uncommon words are also longer than the common words, because that would be a confound. Something could be causing the results other than what I think I'm manipulating, which is, frequency of the words. Okay. Um, so some things you can think about, and these are kind of just general useful things to be aware of when you're designing research, ways we can improve our study. One is to conduct what's known as a pilot study. So this is basically running a small scale version of your study. It's kind of just used to test out your materials and your procedures. Okay. Then if you run into any problems, you can correct those before running the full study. So you might run, say, 10 participants, um, see how that goes, look at the results. It's not enough to tell you the whole story. It might not be um, a big sample, so it might not be super useful, um, but it might it might make you aware of any glaring flaws with your study. And obviously, you can correct those before running the full study, before running all participants. That's what we mean by pilot study. Another useful thing you can do to improve your study is include a manipulation check. Um, this is done to measure the success of your independent variable, and it can be really useful in interpreting your results. So what this is although remember we said that independent variables are the things that you manipulate. The dependent variable is the thing that measure in response to changes in the independent variable. Although that's of course true, sometimes we actually want to find a way to measure our independent variable to see, is it doing what we want it to do? So to give you an example, let's say I looked at um, the effect of anxiety on memory. So I split people up, or I did some sort of manipulation to induce anxiety in one condition, and then at a control condition, people are just not anxious or normal levels of anxiety. I have them study a bunch of words, and then they have to remember as many words as they can. And I would, of course, compare, is the group that I made anxious, are they performing worse than the group who I didn't make anxious? Well, let's say the study doesn't work, we don't find any significant differences. An important question would be, um, did the manipulation, was it adequate or was it successful? It could be the case that in the real world, anxiety definitely impacts memory, right? Seems plausible. But maybe I just wasn't successful at manipulating anxiety. Whoever I did that didn't actually make people more anxious. Well, that's where a manipulation check can come in. What you could do is in that situation is actually run some sort of survey to measure anxiety and find out, was the group that I tried to make anxious, were they actually more anxious than the group that was not supposed to be anxious? Okay, so actually measure although you're manipulating it at some point in the experiment, actually measure their anxiety and see, is my manipulation actually making them anxious or not? That would be a manipulation check. So then we would know, is that maybe the problem with the experiment? Maybe I'm not actually manipulating anxiety and the manipulation's not working. On the other hand, if maybe it's there, but it's very small, it's inadequate. On the other hand, maybe I find out that I did successfully manipulate anxiety, but so therefore, anxiety maybe just doesn't affect memory in this particular case. I would know that because I know I did successfully manipulate anxiety. So that's what we mean by a manipulation check. So measuring in some way your independent variable and seeing, is it actually doing, is it actually manipulating what I want it to? Okay, so those two things can relate to internal validity because, of course, you're not really manipulating what you think you are, or you're not successfully manipulating anything. Manipulation check can help with that. Pilot study could as well. On to external validity. This is another important concern, but it depends a lot on what it is you're researching. So sometimes external validity is very important, other times maybe not. So the main question with external validity is, do the results actually generalize? Do they apply beyond your sample and your research setting to the real world? Okay. So if I'm looking at anxiety and memory, is that actually generalizable or similar to the way we would see that operate in the real world? So people who are actually anxious for, say, an exam, is that comparable to the anxiety in my study? There's of course factors that can um, make your research setting unlike the real world or more like the real world. It kind of just depends on how realistic the setting is and how realistic the actual psychological processes that go on in the experiment. Um, Another big one with regard to external validity is the sample you use. So a big thing here is, let's say I'm looking at, or by the way, we'll talk about samples a lot in the next section, but just to give you kind of a brief overview, the sample is going to be the people that do your study that are meant to represent um, the people you're actually interested in applying this to. So let's say, for example, I'm interested in, teen drinking, so something to do with teen drinking. And in my experiment, or my correlation or whatever, I instead look at older adults. Well, the sample there is not really representative of who I'm actually interested in applying these results to because it's not the right age group. That's kind of an obvious example, but hopefully you get the point there. So that's something we need to consider as well, is how well does this sample actually represent who I'm, you know, thinking about applying these results to. Okay? Again, we'll talk more about that, specifically samples. So when it comes to internal and external validity, the value of each can depend on your particular research goal. And more specifically, whether your research is more basic or more applied. Right? Um, so I think I said the word applied, is external validity has a lot to do with whether your results can actually be applied to the real world. So not surprisingly, external validity tends to be more important in applied research than basic research. In contrast, internal validity tends to be more important when it comes to than external validity when it comes to basic research. So if you've forgotten what those mean, I'll just refresh you quickly. So remember, basic research, we're just interested in understanding things for the sake of understanding. We're asking basic questions like how does memory work? How do people interact socially? And we don't have a specific application in mind. We're not looking to solve a specific applied problem. With applied research, it's the opposite. We're of course looking at a more specific applied problem. How do we prevent teens from smoking? So you could probably imagine where internal and external validity would be more important, more or less important, depending on the question at hand. Um, if I'm looking at something like a memory process, does it really matter if the study is not externally valid, if it's not that realistic or generalizable? Probably not, right? I mean, we're just looking at kind of establishing evidence for or against a certain theory of memory. Um, we're not even looking to necessarily apply it to some real world phenomenon. Um, so in that case, the question, we're just interested in theory and explaining how a process works. So if our goal is really just to understand a certain process, then it's really just about, well, I wouldn't want to say just about, but mostly about the internal validity of the study. Are there confounds, stuff like that? Am I measuring what I think I'm measuring? All that stuff. However, when you're talking about something that is meant to be applied to a real scenario, external validity becomes much more important. So, for example, let's say again, I'm looking at teens and smoking. How do we prevent teens from smoking? Well, however I test that, whether it's a correlation or some sort of experiment, I kind of need it to be somewhat realistic, right? I need it to be somewhat representative of the actual behavior in the real world because that's what I'm going to apply it to. So if what you find in the lab is kind of out of touch with actual smoking behavior in the real world among teens, well, the research is not really that useful in terms of actually applying it, right? I'll give you some more examples in just a bit. Now, with all that said, internal validity is very important for both. So we need to be aware of potential confounds, potential alternative explanations, whether it's applied or basic research. But external validity tends to be more important for applied research. Um, And there's also, there can be some degree of trade-off here. So oftentimes when you increase internal validity, you might actually decrease external validity. When you decrease internal validity, or when you increase external validity, you might actually decrease internal validity. So I'll give you another example. Let's say I'm looking at applying practice exams as a study method. So rather than say rereading your notes, I'm going to have you take a practice exam and find out is that a good way to study, say compared to rereading your notes. Well, if I conduct this in a carefully controlled lab experiment, um, I'm going to basically have the most control possible over the study, right? I can control what people do. I can control the materials they're using, what they're studying, how long they have to study, um, all that good stuff, right? It's a very highly controllable environment. However, that's a bit lacking in external validity. It's not as, you know, similar as we might see this in the real world. So an more externally valid version of that would be to actually implement this in a classroom. So rather than in the lab, you know, have find a way, or maybe even use a correlation to find out are practice exams a good study. However, in that situation, though I would increase external validity, I might actually lose some control over what people are doing. I'd have less control over extraneous variables, even potentially confounds. I don't know how focused people are. Are they doing it right? Are they are they actually correctly implementing the practice exams? Stuff like that, right? I don't have as much control over those factors. So I might lose some internal validity in favor of external validity going up, right? That's These are things to think about though, right? Always consider um, what should be the priority, external or internal validity. I mean, ideally we want both, but something to consider. Okay, so to kind of build a bit on what I was just saying, the lab is going to always have the greatest control over extraneous variables. So let's say, let's again keep with that example about testing. So taking a practice exam as a method of studying. I mean, there's two ways I could do that. Let's say I run that in a lab and I have people do, I provide the materials they're supposed to study. Um, I provide, exact instructions. I, create a computer program that kind of forces them to follow the exact method I want. Well, that's great because all that can be used to control extraneous variables, right? I don't have to worry about things like some people studying more than others. I don't have to worry about, them not following instructions, not doing the practice test correctly, all kinds of stuff like that, right? I don't really have to worry about those as much because I can control those things. On the other hand, if I were to run that same study, let's say I just ask a bunch of people to sign up and I record I tell one group, okay, I want you to take practice exams for as a method of studying. And I kind of leave it up to them, do it however they want. Well, I mean, in a way, that's more externally valid because it's similar to what they might do in the real world, but I also have less control over what they're doing. So, do they actually do what they're supposed to? Do they test themselves? Do they look at the answers? Do different people spend more or less time studying? Bottom line is there's a lot less control over what people are doing when you test something outside the lab. Okay. Now, with that said, sometimes in a lab you can boost the external validity. You can make it more like a simulation. So two factors here when it comes to realism and kind of actually simulating the real world application. There's something known as mundane realism, and there's also experimental and psychological realism. So mundane realism just means the physical conditions mimic that of the real world. Experimental and psychological realism is whether the psychological experience actually mimics the real world. Um, and again, these might be more or less important depending on your research question at hand. So maybe some sort of cognitive process, like driving and cell phones. Does it need to have mundane realism? I don't know. Maybe, probably not. Possibly. It's tough to say. If I'm dealing with something emotional, some sort of emotion related study, well, then I do really need some psychological realism. I do actually need them to be experiencing the intended emotion. So psychological realism becomes important in that situation. Again, bottom line is it depends a lot on your study. I'm going to post this video. I can't include it in the lecture because I get a copyright issue. It'll just be right under this video under the module. So go ahead and watch that. It's just like 2 minutes long, and then go on to the next thing.